All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and then I have my colleague Jament Self here, so she's going to kind of help me manage the chat and let people in as they um, trickle in late. So I appreciate Jament being here to help me out today. All right, well, let's get started. Um, Really, the focus of today is to just kind of help you all get a better understanding of what the ISAT is measuring and the different resources that are available to help expand like your understanding of the assessment, including like sample items, um, scoring rubrics, all those sorts of things. And hopefully, by giving you kind of a better sense of what the test is measuring and the expectations we have for students, that can help you better support, you know, the students that you teach and work with, because our assessment really is measuring the depth and breadth of our standards. So the ISAT is based on our standards. That's what's its driving force. That's how the items are developed. Uh, so everything that we talk about today, while it's kind of within the context of uh, that summative assessment, know that it really is the assessment is measuring the expectations of our standards. So we'll go ahead and get started. Just a little bit about me, because I always like to know the human behind the presenter. So my name is Amber Van Voren. I am the interim and formative assessment coordinator here at the Idaho Department of Education. I like to say in my previous lives, I was an elementary teacher, kindergarten, first grade, fourth grade, so kind of the spectrum of elementary school. I also worked as a regional math specialist for Boise State, supporting elementary, and then also a little bit into the middle school. And then prior to taking this job at the state, I was a math instructional coach for the Valley View School District. So working alongside teachers in their classrooms during their planning, um, just to kind of make sense of, how students were thinking and come up with different ideas or ways to support them. I enjoy crocheting and board games, and my adorable cat Persimmon, who is an orange tabby. And so I always have to share a picture of her because I love her very much. So maybe you all don't like to know about people's pets, but I'm going to share with you all anyway. And just a little bit about, what kind of drives me as an educator is I'm really passionate about building capacity in others. So helping others recognize their strength, building their knowledge so they can go out and do their best and grow. And then really believing that all students can achieve like great things. So holding high expectations for every student. There are often, scaffolds and supports we put in place to help them achieve that, but it's not about lowering the bar. It's how do we help them rise to it? So that's a little bit about me as an educator. Now, so I can get to know a little bit about all of you, if in the chat you would post your name and then the grade level or courses that you teach or whatever your role is, um, or how you might support. And then if you want to share about your pets or something else fun about you as a, human outside of education, feel free to do that as well. I'll give you a few minutes to put that in the chat. Awesome. Thank you all so much for telling me a little bit about yourself. I love that you have a school mascot that is a bird. So thank you for sharing about that. Um, yeah, it looks like we, you know, have kind of the whole middle to high school range connected. So that's great. And all the resources that we have today will apply to um, whatever grade level you teach. So to give you an overview of what we'll kind of talk about today, we're going to focus first on just what is the ISAT actually measuring? Again, it's a measuring of our standards, but what does that look like specifically on the assessment? We'll talk a little bit about what it means to achieve like proficient. When we say a student is at that level 3 or proficient, what does that mean? We'll dive into just do a quick very surface level dive into what resources are available, and then have time at the end for you guys to really dive into those resources and start thinking about where they might fit within the context of how you support students. Are there any, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat. Um, you can also come off mute and interrupt me if that works for you as well. I don't mind that. Um, and I had another thought, but it is gone. So we're going to move on. Hey, so just to kind of, get you warmed up, you can keep this to yourself or put it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. But I want you to choose one of these sentences to finish. So either the purpose of assessment is to, or I can use assessment to. And again, feel free to just think about it independently. You can share it in the chat if you're comfortable doing that, but no expectation. So I'll give you a couple minutes to do that independently. Great. Thank you to those that were feeling brave and added it to the chat. I think those are all great uses and ways to think about assessment. And for those of you that kept it to yourself, hopefully you saw some similar trends as well in your own thinking. When we talk about assessment, and one of the goals that our team here at the department has really been trying to work on is sending the message that there are various types of assessment. They're not always formal. A lot of them are in the classroom. Um, and that the key thing about assessment is making sure we're choosing the right assessment or the right tool for the right purpose. So whenever we're gathering data or information, we want to make sure that we have a clear purpose in mind and how we are going to use that information, so that we can appropriately select the tool that will give us that information. So when we talk about assessment, today we're going to lean more into like a specific assessment tool, but it can also mean more broadly the process of gathering evidence of student thinking. So always keep that in mind, that the general process of assessment is really trying to get at how are students thinking about the concepts we're teaching them, because that's what gives us the why of where they may be struggling and also where their strengths are. Um, in general, assessments kind of live along this continuum of two interconnected purposes. So using that data instructionally, so to inform our lesson plans, inform next steps for students, or more evaluatively, which a couple of you hit on, right? Like, hey, how is my teaching going? Do I need to make any like major adjustments? Is my curriculum doing what I hope it will? Um, So we kind of have these two opposite ends of this continuum, and then various types of assessment will serve one of those purposes usually more than the other. So the summative ISAT, really its main purpose is in that evaluation idea, to be able to evaluate our systems, the supports we have in place, the curriculum. It's not evaluative as in like, what am I going to do the next day for this kid? It's really looking at kind of that broader picture. Um, but we can make some instructional decisions, like I said, around the curriculum, the pacing, based on those trends that we might be seeing. And then at the other end of the spectrum are the formative assessment practices that um, you as teachers do on a day-to-day basis when you're having conversations with students or, chatting back and forth with them, really seeing kind of how they're thinking about things, and that can inform your support in the moment or the next days. The overarching thing, which I just always love to reiterate multiple times, is that anytime we're gathering data or using assessment tools, we need to have that purpose. That should be the essential driving factor. What is the purpose of giving this, and the purpose of the information we're getting back? I'm not going to read through this list, but these are just some of the ways that we use various types of educational assessments. Um, when we're talking about the summative ISAT, it's really going to live in that first bullet point. So evaluating systems, programs, and curriculum and resources. Other assessments like the interims can do a little bit more of like monitoring and effectiveness of our classroom instruction. Depending on how we're using things, we could have a benchmark that measures growth throughout the school year. But we always, again, want to make sure we're choosing the right tool based on the purpose of how we're going to use that data. And then anytime we're giving kind of a more formal assessment, especially like the ISAT summative, we want to make sure that we're ensuring valid results. And when we talk about things being valid, we're really talking about the inferences that we can make from the data. So the tool itself is not valid. It's the data and the inferences we make from that data that we would consider valid. So when we're giving the ISAT summative assessment, using those standardized procedures helps ensure that those results and the inferences we can make from them are as accurate and valid as possible so that we can make informed decisions about programs and systems, curriculum instruction, and then allocations of support and resources. So again, the summative is really looking more at that systems level view, and that's how we view it at the state. It's not a, hey, this school is doing bad, this school is doing good. It's how are things going? Where might we need to, devote more time, resources, those sorts of things to really help all students be successful. All right. So I know that was kind of just a brief overview, but we always like to set the stage of just what is assessment, why do we do it, and kind of what are the purpose or purposes of that within education. So diving now more into the ISAT itself, you can either, if you're on camera, you're welcome to actually do this with your hands. You can put a number in the chat, but just kind of a quick formative assessment from FIST to 5. So FIST being, I don't really know anything about it. 5 meaning, Amber, I could probably be teaching this. Rank how well you currently understand like the structure of the summative ISAT. So claims, targets, how they connect to Idaho standards. Take a few moments to, again, you can either show me on your fingers or put a number in the chat. See a math teacher in there with the abbreviation of pi. Awesome. So based on what everyone put, we seem like on average to kind of be in that 3 range. So I won't spend a ton of time in this section since it seems like at least you have, a base understanding. Um, but again, if at any time I'm going too fast, feel free to interrupt or drop something in the chat. So when we were talking about the structure of the ISAT, in math and ELA, we use the term claims. In science, we talk about domains. And really, what those are is just a big overarching umbrella of key understandings within a content area. So in ELA, we have reading, writing, speaking, listening, and research, right? So those kind of big umbrella areas within ELA. And then in math, the claims are around concepts and procedures, but then also those math reasoning and math practices, that idea of problem solving, communicating our reasoning, um, using math to model and analyze data. So really thinking not just about individual standards, but what are kind of those umbrella um, buckets that we can put our standards into. And then I put science on here. I know that the majority of you, if not all of you, do not teach science, but I did want you to see that parallel structure that the science ISAT has as well. Then when we talk about targets, we're now narrowing it down and looking at groupings of similar standards. So in math, we often call it like a cluster, but it's where multiple standards that are related are grouped together. The reason the ISAT does more like these targets or these groupings of standards is to ensure that we can make, like I said, those valid inferences. If we were to do that at an individual standard level, the test would be so incredibly long because we would need a lot of items around a specific standard. Just so that we had multiple data points to really get, a more accurate view of student performance. So that's why we kind of do these groupings of things. But the standards are embedded in there, and that's what this visual is showing. So we have our claims and then the various targets within them, and then those groupings of related standards that make up that target. And then all together, we have that subject area, the 4 claims, and then across the claims, there's varying levels or amounts of kind of targets within there. And same thing with those groupings of standards. My guess is that was probably fairly familiar to most of you based on that 3, but I always like to just kind of help center where are our Idaho standards within these other terms that we use. Moving on to then the ISAT blueprints. If you haven't used these, I highly encourage you to take a look at them. They really outline like the breakdown of the test. It'll give you the distribution of like how many items are related to a specific target, which can help you kind of think about like the prioritization. What is going to be given more prioritization on the assessment and which targets and therefore standards are going to have less kind of prioritization. And I use prioritization rather than importance because I'm not saying that, the lower priority standards that are on the test are not important to teach. They definitely are. But as far as when we're assessing the overall content standards for that grade, they just have, less prioritization of the overall grade level. So looking first at ELA, just take a quick moment, think about what do you notice, maybe what wonderings do you have, and this is just claim 1 for ELA, so it doesn't have writing or anything. Is anyone feeling brave and either wants to come off mute or put in the chat, what are the things you're noticing?
I don't know if this is what you're wanting, but based on the DOK levels, I would say key details and word meanings are probably kind of a ground level of basic knowledge. And then the ones that we know the kids probably should be starting to master would be the ones that have DOKs of 3 and 4. So those are just some like things that stand out to me based on the DOK levels.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And I'm not looking for anything specific. That's why I love the question, what do you notice? Because it really is as open-ended as it seems. But I also get it because I'm that person that's like, is that the answer? Is that what you're looking for?
So this is not a statement, this is a question. I noticed there are numbers in front of each of these things. Is that the number of times they're asked, or is it the domain number? Like the very top says two central ideas, and I don't know what the two represents there.
Yeah, great question. So that is the target number. So like when you see your target reports and it's like target one or target two, they're not in order here just because of the way that we're grouping them. But that's what this two means is target two is around central ideas for literary texts. Um,
So
and
then
then, yeah,
why
go
would
ahead.
it be, sorry, why would it be central ideas 9 below?
Because there is a separate target, because this is central ideas in relation to informational texts.
Okay.
Yep, great question.
Literary is the domain, and then central ideas is the target.
Yeah, so kind of that like overall claim is around reading, and then we have kind of these like content categories. Um, And so you'll see, like if you look at the full print blueprint, you'll see some like repeat numbers or a couple of this mirroring around the writing, since there's different genres, right? We have the argumentative, explanatory, and well, not narrative in high school, but narrative for all the other grade levels. So you'll see some of the numbers will repeat, but often then they might have a different number because it's a different genre. Great questions. Any other questions, noticings?
I can see how many items will cover these things. So like when I look and I see cat items, I can see that. And I can also see which ones are machine scored and which ones are short text, I think.
Yeah, and um, the majority, if not all at this point, of even like short responses and extended responses are automated scoring at this point, um, using a scoring system that has been trained using, human raters and human scores, and is continually checked against that. But that's one of the reasons we can get our scores back so quickly after the assessment. Um, so when it says machine scored, yes, this is more just kind of like those interactive elements, multiple choice, uh, multiple select, and then short text would be kind of like fill in the blank or short responses. Great question or great wondering. Perfect. So then talking kind of about the number of items, earlier we discussed a little bit about how you can use the blueprint to maybe see that prioritization. So that first yellow grouping is saying that for targets 2 and 4, among those two targets, an individual student would see 1 to 3 items on the cat portion. So that doesn't mean 1 to 3 items per each of those. It's 1 to 3 among those two targets. Whereas the blue grouping has 1 to 3 items distributed among these 5 different targets. So you'll notice the likelihood that a student is going to get, um, not the likelihood, there is no way a student would get one question for each of those 5 targets, right? Because they're only going to see 1 to 3 questions distributed among those 5. So as you're trying to think about, um, again, where might we need to provide extra support, looking kind of at how those items are distributed on the blueprint can give you some insight into the prioritization that they will take for any individual student. This is the other reason that we can't in the reports give like individual or like student level data on a specific standard, because they're not necessarily seeing you like every target, because it's designed really for how are they performing overall, and then that more disaggregated data at the system or group level rather than individually. Here is the example for math, claim 1. And again, just a couple moments to look through maybe what was similar between this and the ELA blueprint, what was different, things you noticed. Then if anyone is feeling brave and wants to share their noticings or their wonderings in relation to math.
Again, mine's going to come in a form of a question. So I see on the content category, we have priority and supporting clusters, whereas I don't think that's the way the other one was organized. And what are the different? I mean, obviously with name, priority and supporting, but how are those two things different?
Yeah. So that really comes because they're two different content areas. So if you look at our math standards, it has like those symbols, right? It has like square and triangle and circle. So those levels of priority, whereas like the major work of the grade level, and that prioritization is not reflected in the ELA standards in the same way, right? It's organized more by literary text or informational texts. Or was, and I know there's been some reorganization. So that's why this will be like, here's priority clusters, because that's how our standards for math are kind of set up as well. So great question. It's a little bit, as you can see, easier to kind of see that prioritization reflected on the test for math than in ELA, where you kind of have to look more at that grouping of like how many items are distributed to kind of see that prioritization. Yeah, so in the CAT, a lot of you said that for this claim, there's really only DOK levels 1 and 2. And I will say that is true for math for this claim only. So claims 2 through 4, which were like problem solving, communicating, reasoning, that's where the claims, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. That's where those deeper level of DOKs come in. And you'll see it a lot more on the performance task as well. So the performance task really deals with claims 2 through 4, whereas the computer adaptive, not all, but a good chunk of it is really focused on concepts and procedures, which are more just that skill recall level, and also then application to problems. So didn't mean that those other depth of knowledge does not exist. However, it doesn't live in this claim. So you'll again want to look at the full blueprint. And I always, especially when I was a math instructional coach, would encourage teachers to look at those other claims and not just get bogged down in claim 1 where the content lives. Because if we just focus on the content, you'll notice we're not necessarily going that depth of knowledge that we really need for students to be proficient and successful, not just on the assessment, but in math moving forward as well. So same kind of groupings here. You'll notice that targets E and I will have 3 items distributed among the 2 of them, whereas then these 4 supporting targets have 1 item distributed among them. So we know for certain that a student will only see an item for one of those targets, not one for each. Any other wonderings about the blueprint? And when I send the slide deck to you, there's a hidden slide that shows where you can find them. Later, when we do resource exploration, the handout I have for you has like the link and navigation on how you can get there too. So if you're like, where do I find these? I promise I will get that to you. Hey, so what does this look like in practice, right? We looked at kind of that distribution of items. We looked at kind of those DOK levels, but how is that actually assessed on the test? So this is a math sample item. It is not from one of the interims. Sample items are publicly released, so they are available. They can be shared with families, community members. You can include them in presentations because they are publicly available. One thing that I always encourage educators to do when they're working with students through sample problems is to focus more on the thinking of how they like tackle the problem or approach it. While we can talk about the content, and that's important, they're never going to see necessarily that specific item. So focusing more on what is the thinking that you're doing to help break this problem apart to make it more accessible to you will help them on the test as a whole, but also just in general problem solving, right? When they come to things in the world, like, hey, what is the problem or what is the question? Thinking about what should my answer look like? What information do I need in order to answer that question or solve whatever problem? So I want you to take a few minutes. And if you're an ELA, I know this one is going to stretch you a little bit, hopefully. An ELA item is coming, so we'll stretch the math people as well. But just take a minute and think through kind of your process of how you might tackle this. And then we'll come back in a minute. And if you want to attempt to actually answer it, feel free to do that too. I'm going to give you about 1 more minute to kind of think through this. Probably won't actually fully answer the question. That's okay. All right, I'm going to stop you there. Thank you for sharing your idea in the chat. I always like to show kind of what a sample item is and then kind of talk through, like if we were in person, So it'd look a little bit different, but talk through what I would do if I was working with a student or a group of students to really work through this. Um, so I'd first just kind of have them glance through the problem and then have them focus on, well, what is the question? Because before we can really dive in, we want to make sure we're clear on what it's actually asking us to do. Um, I'm sure it happens in ELA as well. Math is more my background, but we always have those kids that are like, I know the answer. And they give me a number. And I'm like, great, that's not what this question is asking for, though. It's not looking for a number. It's also not just looking for yes or no that Ted's claim is correct, right? We need to justify that. So this is getting at that claim three, justifying or communicating our reasoning, and is a little bit deeper depth of knowledge. So really giving students in the habit first of, okay, what's kind of the gist of the problem that's being asked? What is the specific question or thing I'm trying to figure out? Um, and then in math, it's kind of like, well, what should my answer look like? Is it an equation? Is it a number? Is it an explanation? Just getting students to hopefully pause long enough, but also gives them kind of a standardized starting point. I know in my experience, a lot of students, their biggest struggle was getting started because it seemed overwhelming and they're like, I don't even know where to begin. So giving them kind of, an internal list of questions that they can think through whenever they come to a question that may be a little bit overwhelming. Um, and for students who are kind of those mental calculators or um, figure out answers fairly quickly, it's a mental checklist to help kind of maybe slow their thinking down so they can have that like metacognition of what is your brain doing? How did you arrive at this answer? So a little bit about this item, and when we get into the resources, I'll show you where the sample items website is and how you can find this. But like I said, this is assessing claim 3 in math. It's will give you the target description, and then this is an item that has a scoring rubric. So depending on, you know, what students have or have not included in their answer, they could receive kind of varying points. More of those depth of knowledge those DOK like 1 or 2 questions are usually only going to be 1 point. But as we get deeper into those DOK levels, um, we usually have more opportunity for like partial credit in these types of items. All right, so for the ELA one, unfortunately, I could not show the entire thing because it will not fit on a single screen because it's like, here's an entire passage. But I want you to just, again, kind of scan through it, think through what is this question actually asking of students or asking of you if you are putting yourselves in their shoes. Again, kind of thinking like, what should your answer look like in relation to what's being asked? And then what information might you need? And I know you can't see all of it, but hopefully it gives you kind of enough of a picture to start thinking about that.
So they're going to need the ability to identify like claims and the structure of the piece.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be something that I would work with the student is like, where do we typically find those? How do you know that that's the argument? Can you check the following paragraphs to see if that is indeed the content that's going through here? So that parallel structure element, and then also recognizing and evaluating claims and not just claims, but central ideas of text.
So the reason I chose this item is because it's just asking students to write a conclusion, right? Which I know when I was in school, which was quite a while ago, was not a thing we were ever asked to do, right? It's, hey, let's do the entire piece as opposed to adding to something, or we might revise a piece, but we weren't necessarily adding our own writing to something that existed. Um, and I think this is also an example of a question that can go across content areas because, hey, if I'm writing a conclusion, just like Becca was saying, I need to go back and figure out, well, what are their arguments? What is the evidence that they're using to support those? Because if I'm going to write a conclusion, that's still kind of summarizing the rest of this piece of writing. And so I can't just go off and like write my own conclusion using what I know about the Magna Carta or whatever topic it might be on. So again, applying that same understanding of, well, what information do I actually need to answer this question? But also giving kids and students opportunities to write in different ways, where maybe we're just doing an introduction based on information, or maybe we're just doing a conclusion. So really trying to think about how could we take some of these tasks and integrate it in the way that we have students interact with content or um, the ways that we support them. So again, just kind of some of the background. This one was focused on writing. It had a depth of knowledge 3 because it really is that synthesis, right? I have to look through somebody else's writing. It's not just creating a conclusion, but it's what claims are being made, what is the evidence that's supporting there, and then how do I kind of match that voice in whatever response I create. And then this is another example where they could receive partial credit depending on kind of where they are.
So one of our
No,
most
go for it.
common scores that we're seeing when I'm looking at our ISAT data is NA. I'm assuming that means that they did not answer it because it
So
says insufficient text if they like put something but it wasn't related, I think.
yeah, and so this example is like from the computer adaptive portion. Um, and what you're talking about is more like the full ride, the ELAPT. And you're right, usually like not scored or insufficient text. Um, Usually it could mean that they didn't answer it. It could also mean that they literally just copied and pasted everything. Whereas like insufficient text might be they copied and pasted like a good portion of the actual source material, but there was maybe some of their writing, just not enough to actually create a score from. Um, so NA, like you said, is usually they didn't answer it or so much like the majority of it was from the source material that there wasn't really any student work to kind of go based on.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay. Awesome. So I know we've gone through a lot so far, so I'm going to pause um, before we go into our next activity, which will have some time for independent exploration. But any questions or clarification just kind of about the structure of the ISAT, how the standards are presented to students? Again, I know those were only 2 sample items, but all right. I just wanted to give sufficient wait time. Sometimes in my head, I have to be like, nope, give longer than you think you should. All right. So now we're going to dive a little bit more into like when we talk about proficient, what does that look like? Um, so think back to those items we just explored. You can kind of think about both of them or just the one related to your content area. And think about what would you need to see from students to feel confident that they truly understood the concept that was being, or concepts that were being measured, not just that they got the right answer. So thinking beyond just was it right or not, what would you need to see to know that they truly had a good understanding of it. And we'll just do some independent think time for a minute. And then in the chat, if you want to give no more than a sentence, which I know will be hard, so maybe just a few words, what would you want to see from students to know, to have a good understanding that they had grasped that concept of what you would consider to be a proficient level? Awesome. So I'm seeing a lot of the ideas of reasoning, justification, like application, transferring it to something if they're less familiar with, which is what our standards are getting at, right? It's not just what do they know, but it's what can they do with what they know, which is what the ISAT is designed to measure. So just like you said, that reasoning, the application, and then transfer. There, I think Clayton said that you may have already done some exploration of the achievement level descriptors. Putting proficiency into words is how I kind of think about it, because they really describe like what students at each of those achievement levels no one can do in relation to whatever target I'm really honed in on. So what does it mean for a student to be proficient in relation to this specific math concept? Or when I say problem solving, what does it mean what does it look like when a student is proficient? Um, it really helps kind of illustrate how expectations shift across different achievement levels. And again, just wanting to reemphasize that the achievement level descriptors, or the ALDs, really are reflecting the expectations of our standards. So as you're working in your PLC groups or with your grade level or your content teams, really thinking, what are the standards expecting of students and at what level? So here is an example from ELA. We're not going to spend a ton of time here, and we're going to look at a math one in a minute because I am going to give you time to explore them on your own. But as you kind of glance through this, I want you to think about what are the changes that you see as we go from a level 1 to a level 4? What are kind of the changes or shifts that we're noticing? Where do we see the shift maybe from more like teacher-centered to student-centered? And what stands out to you that is letting us know it's not just that level 1 depth of knowledge or that surface level recall? Yeah, we have some great ideas in the comments. So if you haven't read your colleagues' ideas yet, I encourage you to do so. A few of the patterns I saw were just the amount of evidence, like there's minimal evidence, there's partial evidence, up to that idea of thorough evidence. Um, Also, that idea of using evidence in either like creative ways or kind of a higher level reasoning, making, really substantial inferences. I think someone also talked about the distinction between when they say like, oh, it's an opinion versus it's an argument, and what does that mean? Really kind of helps distinguish those levels as well. So keeping these three questions in mind, let's look at a math example. So what's changing? Where do you see a shift? What words or phrases stick out that are helping you kind of distinguish between the levels? Give just a few more seconds. So some of you noted just, the difference in the type of reasoning or processing. So levels 1 and 2 talk about like identify. Level 3, it's like mapping or displaying, making some representation in addition to identifying relationships. Some of you talked about the shift in like that transfer, that application. So from things that are familiar, so level 1s and 2 really talk about being able to do this with familiar situations or with support in unfamiliar situations. And once we get to that proficient, so level 3 and above, it's really, can students do it with less support and in situations that maybe are not familiar or routine? Can they take what they know and apply it to novel contexts? Okay. So I'm going to give you, we'll start with about like 7 minutes, and I'll drop this link in the chat. So the achievement level descriptors really live in Content Explorer, which you can get to from Tools for Teachers. And again, when I give you the reference handout later, it will show you how to get back to here. But you'll select whatever grade level is applicable to what you teach. This will only have math and ELA, so it's not available for other subjects. So you can choose either English language arts or math. Just kind of choose one claim and one target to explore an achievement level descriptor for. So I'm going to show you. I just chose communicating reasoning. I could select target here or scroll down and select it here. If I click the more button and then look for range ALDs, or I can just scroll and then hit the plus sign and it will give you those. So let's start maybe with 5 to 6 minutes, then we'll check in. If you need help, I know I navigated to that pretty quickly. If you need help, let me know and I'm happy to re-show how to get here. But find a claim and target related to content that you teach. And then just think about, what do you notice? What are some of the wonderings? What was validating about what you already understand as far as student expectations? Were there anything that were surprising? All right, I think the majority of us are back, so we'll go ahead and move on. Let's start with ELA. What was a takeaway or two, or things that you guys discussed?
One thing we noticed is that we've been unpacking standards within our PLC, and we're using the essential standards developed by the state for that. And one thing that stood out to us was that in some of these they're not using the essential standards, they're using the full spectrum of standards. So my question is, in terms of like, we talked about how there's more weight given to certain sections. Are those essential standards developed by the state, are they aligned with the items on the ISAT that has higher weight?
So the essential standards are a guidance document that was developed by the State Department of Education with a group of teachers, but it is intended to be like, hey, this is a really good place to start, but it's not like a mandated or official set of standards. I don't like the word mandated, but that's the one that came out. And by law, our test has to cover the full breadth and depth of all of our standards, which includes those that have been officially adopted by the board. So the essential standards will have some overlap with kind of those priority or more prioritized targets. But that's another thing to kind of keep in mind is the essential standards guidance document really goes to that individual level of each standard, whereas the ISAT is groupings of related standards.
Thank
So you'll
you.
see some of that prioritization reflected, but it won't ever just assess the essential standards that are in that guidance document because they have not been officially approved by the board, and it is not all of our standards, which the test is designed to measure. Great clarifying question, though.
We have a lot of
Anything?
rubrics that we've made throughout our system. We work in Canvas, and that's very rubric friendly. And I heard a comment in the English discussion that said, "Well, this would really change what we're putting on our rubrics, and also be really helpful to us to say these are the things that we have to look for." So this could be an incredibly helpful tool in our grading rubrics.
I love that you are using rubrics. I think they're one of the most underutilized tools. Um, and especially because you can show that to students. So like they know kind of what is expected. Um, if they're, coming in at a level one, you can be like, well, what are the things that you could do to get to the level two? And that isn't always as overwhelming as being like, here's where I want you to get. What is that big jump? It's like, what are those kind of incremental steps along the way that can allow students to show progress too? Awesome. Math. What were some of the things you noticed?
I'll jump in. To be honest, we spent more time just like showing each other how to navigate to different tools and different parts that we were unaware of in that teacher tool from we wanted to know how to navigate from the portal that we were already somewhat familiar with the ISAT.
Yeah,
So we honestly spent more time like just learning how to navigate from a place that was familiar.
totally fine. What were some of the tools that you were navigating to?
Did I mute? No, I did not. Uh, we were just trying to find like practice tests, and then you can go to, they have lesson plans that are available there, planning tools, assessment tools. Um, that whole site was new to most of the teachers that I was in the room with, so more
Awesome.
just seeing what was there.
Yeah, perfect. Well, it's a good start to the expiration that you will have later on. So thank you all for, getting a head start on that. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your honesty. You were doing what you needed in the moment, and that's great. Hey, so speaking of other resources, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the spotlight things that are available. Um, because we hear a lot, there's a lot of things, it's overwhelming kind of where to start. So we're going to start by just here are some of the key things to be aware of. And then I'll give you some guidance into like, okay, if I'm wondering about this, then this resource might be where I start. Um, and then the rest of our time today will just kind of be for you to dive into a couple of those resources, figuring out what might work best for you. So I'm glad that we kind of had that transition about like practice tests versus interims and summative. So we've talked a lot so far about the summative assessment, but there are two other types of assessments, again, thinking more formally as an assessment as a tool. So we have the practice tests, which are publicly available. So they are not secure items. They've all been publicly released, which is why they have a low security level. Their main purpose is to get students familiar with the test platform. So one key feature of the practice tests is it will prioritize giving students a variety of different interaction types. So like drag and drop, grid items. So the practice test, and I see the question in the comments, so I will come back to that. And I don't know why my screen moved forward. But know that if we're just focusing on platform familiarity and getting kids familiar with how different item types work, the practice tests are going to be your best tool for that. Any students that have accessibility features and accommodations, they can log in with their actual student information, and all of that, assuming it's in the system, will show up on the practice tests, or they can log in as a guest and play around with some of those accessibility features. I've talked to a few districts that have let students kind of experiment with some of the things like color contrast or masking, where it will cover up some of it. And by having students kind of explore those tools, they will able to identify kids that could benefit from it and the color that was most supportive for that kid. So I encourage you to get kids on that, or your students on that as well. The interim assessments, they're focused more on content because we are gathering data potentially. We don't have to, it can be more informal. But because they are specifically designed to measure specific targets or a group of targets, you won't necessarily see as many item types or interactions because we're really just curating items based on the content that's being assessed or measured. They're medium security level, so you can use them formally or informally in your classroom, but they may not be shared publicly. So that means like if you use Google Classroom or some other learning platform, interim items shouldn't be posted on there. But anything that you do like live with students, you could use them in that setting, or you could assign it to students through the platform and have them take it that way. Okay. So there's a lot of information on these slides. It's here more for your reference. I'm not going to read through it all because that would be very boring for all of us. But for these spotlight resources, I've tried to break down just kind of a general description of what is included on this specific site or in this resource. The test development site is connected to Content Explorer, where you found those ALDs. But speaking of rubrics, it will give you scoring rubrics. So for ELA, you can see the actual rubrics that are used for the ELA performance task across all three genres. There are also rubrics for brief writes, which are separate from the full write. And then this is one that I haven't actually explored, but I think there's rubrics on like some of the reading items in there as well. There are general math rubrics that are available on that site as well. So they won't be as specific as the achievement level descriptors, since those are looking at a specific target, which is more related to your content or your standards. But if you're like, hey, can we use kind of a general structure across courses and then maybe fine tune it, that could be a place to start. The other thing I always like to point out with the test development site is there are lists of content relevant vocabulary, which means these are terms that students should be familiar with because they are connected to the content that they are learning, but they also are, for lack of a better word, like fair game. So they are terms that will show up on the assessment with the assumption that students know what they mean because they are connected to the content standards. So if you're wondering, like, how might the test refer to some of these different concepts, those lists can be really helpful for that. If you're providing intervention or additional support, vocabulary is, again, one of the often underlooked things to actually connect or give explicit instruction with in intervention. A lot of students struggle, no matter what the content area with, is because they lack access to the academic vocabulary being used. So that can be really helpful for all learners, not just your English learners. We kind of talked through these, so again, I won't read it for you, but these slides will be here for your reference. The sample items website. Oh, and I have not forgotten about the practice test question, where I will get it when we come to the practice test slide. The sample items website is thousands of publicly released ELA and math items. So knowing that your school is, a virtual school where you're often sending things out to students, I highly recommend these be the sample items or practice things that you have students look at, because there's no concern about whether that item has been released in a way that it shouldn't be, because they're all open access and publicly available. They're also all different than the interim items, and you can filter by claim, target. If you want to know like which types of items allow a calculator versus not allowing a calculator, you can filter by that. You can also filter just for items that would show up on a performance task. So if you wanted to really just hone in on those, and there's a lot more just options there. I encourage the use of sample items or interim items in kind of those non-formal ways. So it's like warm-ups, having class discussions or collaborative groups. I know in your setting, that would obviously look a little bit different. But definitely some flexible ways that you can use them that aren't a formal like test or exit ticket. We've talked a lot, not a lot, but we've talked about the practice tests. I will say I don't know specifically how often the practice tests are adjusted, but I will say they're refreshed a little bit more than the interims are, because as we get maybe new item interaction types, and that's kind of the primary purpose, then some of those might be recycled out. But because they are also publicly released items, they are refreshed as new items become retired or available for public access. The interim items are not refreshed regularly because the main purpose or main focus rather has been on developing more of those focused interim assessment blocks. So like looking at a specific target or concept. I think once we have like that library is getting pretty fleshed out now, then it will shift to reevaluating some of those. So they are still reviewed, they are still analyzed, but you won't see a lot of turnover on the interims themselves, at least for the foreseeable future, which is why maybe thinking about some of those newer interims is a way to refresh what items students might be experiencing. Speaking of interim assessments, I always pitch if you're going to use them. I like the interim assessment blocks or the focused blocks the best. because they are more targeted and focused, whether you're using those more informally or formally through the test delivery system. But they're shorter and they're easier to be like, hey, a student is currently taking this course or currently working on this unit. This is an interim assessment that relates to what they're currently learning. Whereas the comprehensive assessments, the ICA and then the SICA, really are mirroring the summative. So it's covering all of that grade level standards. So in high school, it's not just going to be 11th grade standards, it's going to be 9th through 11th, right? Because these are our high school ELA standards, or these are our high school math standards. In middle school, they're more grade level specific, except in ELA, because we have that in grade bands in our standards as well. But I always push for the interim assessment blocks and focus blocks. And like I said, you can give it through the platform to collect data, but you can also use them in more informal ways. The interim connections playlists, which are available through Tools for Teachers, which was the site that the math group was kind of learning how to navigate, are curated sets of instructional resources directly connected to the math and ELA interim assessments. With that said, you don't have to give that specific interim assessment in order to benefit from the connections playlist, because the interim assessment blocks are around specific targets or groups of targets. I love this resource because it also includes kind of that student performance progression. So what does below look like, at or near? What does above look like? And then gives direct resource lines to, or links to different lesson plans and things as well. The interim assessment, so all the interim assessments, if you give them through the test platform, it would have to be with like a live test session ID. So there's no way to like assign the interim and one student takes it at one period of time and one period, like student takes another period of time, unless you want to set up test session IDs for each of those different options. So you could say, hey, this class of students is going to take it. Here are your 3 options of times that you could come in and take the assessment. But just know it's like the summative assessment that it is going to be whenever the test administrator is there and has a live session going, which also applies. So if you do it remotely, that is an option, but it's still a live test session. And we would encourage you to monitor students. Again, since those are semi-secure items, we'd want to make sure that they're not, taking pictures of them or uploading them into AI. So just some of those things to kind of be mindful of if you're going to do it, especially in that virtual setting. Great questions, though. Awesome. This is a tool that is more specific to ELA, but does have some application or could have some application in other content areas. But the Smarter Annotated Response tool is a collection of actual student writing samples from the ELA performance task that have been scored and are annotated with explanations as to why they received whatever score they did. So the rubrics are available there, but you can also find a range of different grade levels and also scores within a grade level. Definitely helpful for you as a teacher. I also know using like mentor texts or helping students like revise or improve work. Here are some ready-made actual student writing samples that you could use for activities like that as well. If you teach other content areas, looking kind of through some of that scoring rationale, or just thinking about how is this writing rubric applied to student writing, and then thinking, what does that mean when students are writing about their mathematics, right? Because we know that student explanations and being able to justify their reasoning often includes a lot of writing, even in the math classroom. So even though those writing samples are specific to, ELA type genres, there is still some application of what does different levels of student writing look like. And then you could, in your PLCs, maybe talk about what might that look like then applied to writing about math content as opposed to an argumentative essay, say. Okay, so like I said, real fast speed by of different resources. Again, this will be here for reference. But as we talked about before, like always knowing what is your purpose and choosing the right tool for that purpose, that applies to the available resources as well. So if you want to really dive into what is the ISAT testing and measuring, that's where blueprints and Content Explorer come into play. If you want to explore what is meant by proficient, and I will add the ALDs, but the ALDs, the rubrics, the SMART tool can all give insight into that. If you want to think about what tasks or items are students going to experience, sample items, practice tests, or interim assessments, and then thinking about what might be instructional resources like actual lesson plans or strategies I could use, that's kind of where the interim connections playlists come into play. In the chat, I am going to drop a handout, and if you can't open it, please let me know, that has a list of all of the different resources that we've talked about today. And I really want to just give you designated time to choose one of those resources, ideally, but also do what makes the most sense for you in the moment. I'm not going to micromanage that. But maybe choose one or two resources you want to dive more into. We'll start with about 7 minutes of exploration. And as you go through them, again, just kind of those general questions. What do you notice? What are some ways you could apply that? What was something maybe you were like, huh, I had no idea that was available. So just kind of think through that. I'll start like we did with the ALD exploration, where you have some independent time. Then we'll do 2 breakout rooms and then come back together. Any questions or clarifications I can provide before you get started? Okay, go ahead and start diving into some of those resources. Welcome back. Thank you all for participating in the breakout rooms. Let's start with math this time. What were some of the things you talked about? Just maybe share 1 or 2 things from the conversation.
We
I think
noticed there was some great lesson plans Like we actually looked at some and there's PowerPoints and some different things. Go ahead, Done.
Nope, I was just trying to fill awkward silence. That's just what I do.
And we did also talk about like the blueprints and using those to kind of solidify the essential standards and different things to either add to or, you know what I mean, or delete some things. But
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. ELA.
We were kind of in general just discussing what this means for our program and some ways that we might be able to incorporate testing verbiage that's similar or questions that are similar. Yeah, so we were just talking about how there's a lot of things exploding in our brains right now of how we align multiple different steps of what we were already doing and making sure that aligns with the ISAT, and then where do we go from there?
Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad that there are lots of ideas. That is what I would hope would happen from a session like this. So I'm happy to hear that. Okay, well, we just have a few minutes left, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Um, I just want in the chat, if you like sentence starters, they are a habit of mine because I think they really help students with academic language. But you can also just drop whatever takeaway you have. But in the chat, if each of you will either share one resource you plan to open before the end of the semester or one idea you plan to think about before the school year ends. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Well, thank you all for joining today and for participating and sharing your ideas. I will hang around for the next 5 minutes if there's any questions, clarifications, or things you want to discuss. Otherwise, thank you all so much for your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out in the future if you have any questions or want to just have a thinking partner of for how to integrate various things.
Be
I
careful what
appreciate
you
your time
offer,
today.
Amber. I want to just say this. Amber and I met like once, this started with, I was at a state webinar and I saw some of these things and Amber was presenting in that. And then we met once and I kind of explained where our school was, with mapping out essential standards. But this is what I want to say. What a wonderful job you did, Amber. You far
You.
exceeded even what I asked you to do. And wow. And I just, unbelievable. Thank you so much. I have so
Well,
many
thank
things
you.
going through my head right now. This was
I
better than
appreciate
I even asked for, and thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate the feedback. It's always nice to know it was helpful and had the intended objective. So,
And the next part for us, the hard work is the debrief and to actually, I think right now everybody's got to let all this assimilate in our head and say, how do
mhm.
we sort this out? But again, you did an excellent job showing us what is available, how that works, how things are connected. I mean, you just really made this stuff very, very clear, at least to me. Wow.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And on the NA discussion, Amber, so I have data that I scrubbed of student info and was giving it to Gemini, because we have the version that's just for our school. It says that it's NA because students are either assigned one bulk of questions or another bulk of questions. Does that sound right? And so we're seeing NA all over the data because either they're having one half or another half.
Yes, sorry, now that
Okay.
you say that. So in like the summative, right? If they didn't get narrative, it's well, in high school there's not narrative, but let's say they didn't get narrative, it'll say NA across that. And you'll only see scores for argumentative
So
or
really you're
informational.
ignoring all NA scores because
Yep,
the student never saw that question. Okay. Thank
correct.
you. That helps me.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for reminding me of that. All right, well, if there aren't any last minute questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting, but I appreciate all of you and hopefully we'll hear about the good work you guys are doing. So have a
I'm
great rest of
I'm
the
sure
school
at some
year.
point I'll reach out. Thank you, Amber.
Yeah, of course. See ya.